April 9, 1942. Dinjan Airfield, Assam, India. Captain Wally A. Gaida stood beside his C-47 transport aircraft, watching monsoon clouds build over the mountains to the east. Those mountains, the Himalayan range stretching between India and China, represented the most dangerous flight route in the world. Pilots called it simply the Hump, a name that understated the terror of flying unarmed transport aircraft over terrain where peaks exceeded 20,000 feet, where weather changed from clear to deadly within minutes, where Japanese fighters patrolled approaches, where engine failure meant certain death because no emergency landing sites existed in the vertical wilderness below. Gaida's mission orders were straightforward on paper, but suicidal in execution. Fly from Dinjan in northeastern India across the Himalayas to Kunming in southwestern China, carrying supplies for Chinese forces and American forces operating in the China-Burma-India theater. Return empty or with priority cargo. Repeat daily regardless of weather, regardless of mechanical problems, regardless of crew fatigue, regardless of losses. The Hump route existed because Japan had conquered Burma in early 1942, cutting the Burma Road that had been the only land supply route from India to China. With the Burma Road closed, the only way to supply China was by air across the Himalayas. The alternative was allowing China to collapse, which would free millions of Japanese troops for operations elsewhere and would eliminate the strategic threat that China represented to Japanese positions across Asia. America and Britain decided that supplying China by air was essential, despite the costs and despite the casualties that flying the Hump would inevitably inflict. The costs were staggering, and the casualties were catastrophic from the operation's first days. Pilots flying the Hump faced challenges that exceeded anything encountered in other theaters. The route crossed the eastern Himalayas, where dozens of peaks exceeded 15,000 feet, and where several exceeded 20,000 feet. The highest navigable passes were at 16,000 to 18,000 feet, altitudes where the heavily loaded transport aircraft struggled to maintain altitude and where oxygen deprivation affected crew performance. The weather over the Himalayas was among the worst in the world. Monsoons from June through September brought continuous rain, violent thunderstorms, and turbulence that could tear aircraft apart. Winter brought equally dangerous conditions, with ice forming on wings and engines, with visibility dropping to zero in snow squalls, with temperatures so cold that exposed skin froze within seconds. Even during the brief periods of relatively good weather in spring and fall, conditions could deteriorate from clear skies to zero visibility within minutes as clouds materialized around peaks and filled valleys. The aircraft available for Hump operations were inadequate for the mission they were assigned. The C-47 transport, the primary aircraft used during the first years of Hump operations, had a service ceiling of approximately 24,000 feet when empty and much lower when loaded. Flying at 16,000 to 18,000 feet with cargo meant operating near the aircraft's performance limits with minimal margin for maneuvering or for climbing to avoid obstacles or weather. The C-47's engines, while reliable under normal conditions, were prone to failure when operated continuously at high power settings in thin air at extreme altitudes. Engine failure over the Hump meant certain death because the aircraft could not maintain altitude on one engine while loaded, and because the terrain below offered no possibility of emergency landing. The C-47 had no pressurization and minimal heating. Crews flew in unpressurized cabins at altitudes where oxygen was required continuously. They endured temperatures that often dropped below -30 degrees Fahrenheit, where metal became brittle and where any mechanical problem became life-threatening because crew members could not work effectively in such cold. Navigation equipment was primitive by any standard. Most aircraft had basic magnetic compasses that were unreliable near the magnetic anomalies created by the Himalayan geology. Radio navigation aids were almost non-existent. Weather information was minimal and often wrong. Pilots navigated primarily by dead reckoning and by following geographic features when they were visible, but mountains and valleys looked similar, and clouds obscured landmarks constantly. Getting lost over the Himalayas was easy and was usually fatal because there was nowhere to land and because fuel was limited. Japanese forces in Burma posed additional threats. Japanese fighters patrolled the western approaches to the Hump route, waiting to intercept vulnerable transport aircraft. The transports were unarmed and defenseless. Their only protection was altitude, clouds, and the hope that Japanese fighters would not find them. Japanese anti-aircraft batteries were positioned along known flight routes. Transports that flew predictable paths or that descended to avoid weather often found themselves under fire from Japanese positions. The human cost of flying the Hump was measured in aircraft lost and in aircrews killed, statistics that accumulated relentlessly throughout the operation's 42 months from April 1942 through August 1945. Over 600 aircraft were lost during Hump operations. More than 1,500 aircrew members died, and the actual numbers were likely higher because some losses were never documented and because aircraft that disappeared over the Himalayas left no wreckage to confirm their fate. The loss rate during the early months of operations exceeded 30 aircraft per month, with corresponding crew casualties. Pilots calculated that their life expectancy flying the Hump was approximately 6 months, meaning that statistically, half of the pilots beginning Hump operations would be dead within 6 months. These were not combat casualties in the conventional sense. Most deaths resulted from weather, mechanical failures, navigation errors, and the unforgiving terrain rather than from enemy action. But the deaths were just as final, and the fear was just as real as any experienced by combat crews facing enemy fire. The psychological toll of flying the Hump was immense. Pilots and crews knew the statistics. They knew that every mission carried significant probability of death. They knew that their fate often depended on factors beyond their control, like weather that could change without warning or engines that could fail without explanation. They flew anyway because the mission demanded it, because China's survival required the supplies they carried, because refusing to fly meant court-martial and disgrace. The origins of the Hump airlift lay in the strategic situation that developed in Asia during 1941 and early 1942. China had been fighting Japan since 1937, in a war that had killed millions and that had devastated Chinese territory. By 1941, China was barely surviving, dependent on supplies brought via the Burma Road, a 717-mile road connecting Lashio in Burma to Kunming in China. The Burma Road was primitive, vulnerable, and inadequate, but it was China's lifeline. American and British supplies flowed up the road to Chinese forces, allowing China to continue resistance that tied down hundreds of thousands of Japanese troops who would otherwise be available for operations against American, British, and Soviet forces elsewhere. In December 1941, Japan attacked American, British, and Dutch possessions across the Pacific and Southeast Asia. The attacks brought America into the war and created a global conflict where China became part of the Allied coalition fighting Japan. In January 1942, Japanese forces invaded Burma, advancing rapidly against British, Indian, and Chinese defenders. By May 1942, Burma had fallen completely. British forces had retreated into India, and the Burma Road was cut. China was isolated. Japan controlled all of China's coast. Japanese forces occupied vast portions of Chinese territory. The Burma Road was closed. China had no way to receive supplies from its allies except by air. The strategic consequences were clear. If China collapsed, Japan would gain control of Chinese resources and population. Japan would free the troops occupying China for operations elsewhere. Japan would eliminate the threat that Chinese resistance posed to Japanese positions across Asia. America and Britain recognized that preventing China's collapse was essential to overall strategy against Japan. General Joseph Stilwell, commanding American forces in the China-Burma-India theater, and Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek, leading Chinese forces, both argued that supplying China by air was the only option now that the Burma Road was closed. The proposal faced immediate skepticism from logisticians who understood aviation limitations. Flying supplies over the Himalayas would be extraordinarily expensive in terms of aircraft, fuel, and personnel. The tonnage that could be delivered by air would be a fraction of what the Burma Road had carried. The losses would be catastrophic, given the terrain and weather. But the alternative was allowing China to collapse, which was strategically unacceptable. President Roosevelt and the American military leadership decided to proceed with air supply operations despite the costs and despite the casualties that were certain to result. The mission was assigned to the 10th Air Force, operating from bases in northeastern India. The task was to establish and maintain an airlift across the Himalayas, carrying military supplies, weapons, ammunition, fuel, and eventually any cargo that China required to continue fighting. The operation began in April 1942 with a handful of C-47 aircraft, and with crews who had no experience flying in the Himalayas, and who had minimal understanding of what they were being ordered to do. The learning curve was steep, and the tuition was paid in lives. Captain Wally Gaida's first Hump flight in April 1942 was representative of what thousands of pilots would experience over the following 3 years. Gaida took off from Dinjan in early morning, climbing toward the mountains with a full load of ammunition and medical supplies destined for Kunming. The C-47 struggled to gain altitude in the thin air, taking nearly an hour to reach 16,000 feet, where Gaida hoped to clear the ridges ahead. The weather was clear at takeoff, but clouds were building over the mountains as the morning progressed. Gaida followed the valley routes that appeared to offer the safest path through the peaks, but the valleys narrowed and the ridges rose higher until he was flying between mountain walls with minimal clearance on either side. Turbulence from winds hitting the peaks threw the C-47 around violently. Gaida fought the controls to keep the aircraft level, while his co-pilot monitored engine temperatures and fuel consumption. At approximately 90 minutes into the flight, clouds descended into the valleys, reducing visibility to near zero. Gaida could see mountain walls appearing suddenly through the clouds, too close, forcing him to turn sharply to avoid collision. He had no reliable way to know where he was, or which direction would lead through the mountains, versus into a dead-end valley that would trap him against a mountainside. His magnetic compass was spinning uselessly, affected by the magnetic anomalies in the rocks around him. His maps showed the general locations of peaks, but could not tell him where he was at any given moment. Gaida climbed, trying to get above the clouds, but the C-47's engines were already straining to maintain altitude with the heavy load. He leveled off at 18,000 feet, the highest he could achieve, and hoped that he was above the ridges. The clouds extended above his altitude, meaning he was flying blind through mountains that he knew reached above 20,000 feet in some locations. He maintained heading based on dead reckoning, calculating that if he flew long enough on his current course, he would eventually cross the main ridgeline and begin descending toward the Chinese side of the mountains. The calculation assumed his navigation was accurate, which it probably was not given the magnetic anomalies and the wind drift he could not measure accurately. After 3 hours of flying, Gaida's fuel was getting low. He had to make a decision. Continue hoping that he was crossing the mountains successfully, or turn back toward India while he still had enough fuel to reach Dinjan. Turning back meant failing the mission and facing questions about why he had not pushed through. Continuing risked running out of fuel over the mountains with nowhere to land. Gaida continued. 10 minutes later, the clouds began to thin. He descended cautiously, watching for mountain walls in the mist. At 14,000 feet, he broke out of the clouds into clear air, over a valley that appeared to be on the eastern side of the main ridgeline. He had made it through, though he was uncertain of his exact position, and uncertain whether he had simply been lucky that his blind flight through the clouds had not ended with controlled flight into terrain. He navigated by following valleys and rivers toward where Kunming should be located. An hour later, he spotted the airfield and landed after a flight that had taken over 4 hours and that had consumed nearly all his fuel. The ground crew unloaded his cargo. Gaida filed his position reports and described the conditions he had encountered. Then he took off for the return flight to India, flying empty, which made the return trip slightly easier, but still dangerous because the weather and terrain remained unchanged. Gaida's experience became routine over the following months and years. Thousands of flights followed the same pattern. Take off from Indian bases, climb toward the mountains, navigate through valleys and over ridges while trying to avoid weather that could kill and terrain that offered no mercy for error, deliver cargo to Chinese bases, return to India, and repeat. The losses accumulated steadily. Some aircraft disappeared without trace, flying into mountains hidden by clouds or flying into storms that tore them apart. Some crashed during takeoff or landing at the primitive airfields in India and China. Some were shot down by Japanese fighters or by anti-aircraft fire. Some experienced mechanical failures that left them unable to maintain altitude, forcing crews to bail out over terrain where rescue was impossible and where survival was unlikely. The statistics were grim. During the first 6 months of Hump operations from April through October 1942, the 10th Air Force lost over 100 aircraft and over 300 aircrew members. The tonnage delivered to China averaged only about 2,000 tons per month, far below what was needed and far below what the Burma Road had carried before its closure. The operations were unsustainable at these loss rates and this efficiency level. Something had to change, or the Hump airlift would fail, and China would be left without supplies. The changes that improved Hump operations came gradually through hard experience, through better equipment, through improved procedures, and through the arrival of experienced commanders who understood what was needed. In late 1942, the Air Transport Command took over responsibility for Hump operations from the 10th Air Force. The ATC brought organizational expertise and dedicated transport personnel, rather than expecting combat-oriented Air Force units to conduct sustained logistics operations. Colonel Thomas O. Hardin assumed command of the India-China wing of the ATC and began implementing systematic improvements to reduce losses and increase tonnage delivered. Better aircraft began arriving in 1943. The C-46 Commando, a larger transport with more powerful engines and higher service ceiling than the C-47, could carry heavier loads and could fly higher over the mountains, reducing exposure to the worst weather and providing better margins for navigating around obstacles. The C-46 had its own problems, including a tendency for cargo doors to fail in flight and fuel system issues that could cause fires, but overall it was better suited to Hump operations than the C-47. The C-87, a transport variant of the B-24 Liberator bomber, offered even better high-altitude performance and cargo capacity, though it was less comfortable for crews and required more maintenance. Improved navigation aids began to be installed in late 1943 and throughout 1944. Radio ranges and beacons at Indian and Chinese airfields provided some navigational reference for aircraft approaching or departing those bases. Weather reporting improved as weather stations were established along the route, and as meteorologists developed better understanding of Himalayan weather patterns. The improvements were incremental and imperfect, but they reduced somewhat the complete navigational uncertainty that had characterized early Hump operations. Standardized flight routes were established, and crews were trained to follow them. The routes were selected to maximize safety by avoiding the highest peaks and by following valleys that offered the best chance of navigating visually when weather permitted. The northern route ran from Chabwa and Jorhat in India through the Hooghly Valley and over the Santung Ridge to Kunming. The southern route ran from Dinjan through the Fort Hertz Valley and over the Mekong Divide. The routes were not safe, but they were safer than random navigation through the mountains. Training improved as experienced crews shared their knowledge with new arrivals. The lessons were written in blood. Fly high when possible, even though higher altitudes meant more difficult breathing and colder temperatures, because altitude provided margin for error and for avoiding terrain. Avoid clouds over ridge lines because clouds often concealed peaks that extended above expected altitudes. Turn back if weather deteriorated beyond acceptable limits, rather than pressing on and risking controlled flight into terrain. These lessons were taught in formal briefings and were reinforced through informal mentoring by experienced pilots who wanted new crews to survive the learning curve that had killed so many early crews. The human experience of flying the Hump combined extreme danger with mind-numbing repetition. Crews flew mission after mission over the same routes facing the same risks. The missions were not the dramatic one-time experiences of combat operations, where a pilot might fly a few dozen missions before completing his tour. Hump crews flew hundreds of missions, day after day, month after month, until they completed their assigned tours or until they died. The psychological experience was exhausting. Every mission carried significant risk of death, but most missions were completed successfully, creating a paradox where crews experienced constant fear without constant reinforcement of that fear through actual casualties in their immediate experience. They knew the statistics. They knew people were dying, but on most days they flew their missions and returned safely, which made it psychologically difficult to maintain the vigilance and the respect for danger that survival required. Complacency could develop where crews began to believe they were safe because they had survived previous missions, only to die when circumstances combined in fatal ways on what had seemed like a routine flight. The physical experience was brutal. Crews flew at altitudes requiring oxygen for hours at a time. Oxygen systems were prone to failure. Running out of oxygen or experiencing oxygen system failure at 18,000 feet meant rapid incapacitation and death unless the aircraft could descend quickly to breathable altitudes, which was impossible over the highest portions of the route. Cold was constant and debilitating. Temperatures at altitude routinely dropped to -30 or -40 degrees Fahrenheit. Aircraft heaters were inadequate or non-existent. Crews wore multiple layers of clothing, sheepskin jackets, electrically heated suits when available, but still suffered frostbite and cold injuries. The cold made every task more difficult. Hands became numb, making it difficult to manipulate controls and switches. Feet became numb, reducing sensitivity to rudder pedals. Crew members became sluggish and slow to react, increasing risk of errors and accidents. Fatigue was cumulative and severe. Crews flew multiple missions per week, sometimes daily if weather and aircraft availability permitted. Each mission lasted 6 to 8 hours or more, depending on route and weather. The physical stress of flying at altitude in cold while breathing oxygen took a toll that accumulated over weeks and months. Crews became exhausted, their reflexes slowed, their judgment impaired, their resistance to illness weakened. The Army Air Forces recognized that Hump crews could not be expected to fly indefinitely and established tour lengths, Initially 650 flight hours over the hump and later modified based on experience, but even with tour limits, the fatigue was severe and contributed to accidents and losses. The deaths were often lonely and anonymous. When an aircraft disappeared over the Himalayas, there were frequently no witnesses, and no wreckage was recovered because the terrain was inaccessible. Crews simply did not return from missions. They were declared missing and eventually declared dead. Their families received telegrams informing them that their son or husband was missing in action over the China-Burma-India theater. No bodies were recovered for burial. No closure was possible. The dead simply disappeared into the mountains. Some wrecks were discovered years or decades later by mountaineers or by locals in remote valleys. Scattered wreckage and frozen bodies would be found, sometimes with identification that allowed the dead to finally be accounted for. But most hump casualties were never recovered and remain somewhere in the Himalayas, their final moments unknown, their exact fates a matter of speculation based on weather reports and last known positions. The Hump airlift reached its maximum efficiency and tonnage in late 1944 and early 1945 as improved aircraft, better procedures, and experienced crews combined with increased numbers of aircraft assigned to the operation. By mid-1944, the India-China wing of the Air Transport Command was operating over 300 aircraft, including C-46, C-47s, and C-87s. Monthly tonnage delivered to China exceeded 20,000 tons by mid-1944 and reached 44,000 tons in July 1945. These numbers, while impressive compared to early operations, still represented only a fraction of what China needed and what the Burma Road had carried before its closure. The cost remained high. Even with improved operations and better equipment, aircraft continued to be lost, and crews continued to die. The loss rate decreased from the catastrophic levels of 1942, but never approached the safety levels of stateside operations or even of combat operations in other theaters. Flying the Hump remained the most dangerous routine flying in the war. The strategic impact of the Hump airlift was significant, but difficult to quantify precisely. The supplies delivered to China allowed Chinese forces to continue fighting, tying down hundreds of thousands of Japanese troops who would otherwise have been available for operations elsewhere. The supplies enabled American forces operating from Chinese bases to conduct bombing operations against Japanese shipping, Japanese installations, and eventually against the Japanese home islands. The supplies maintained China as an active participant in the Allied coalition, preventing Japanese conquest of Chinese resources and Chinese population. These strategic benefits were real and important, but they came at enormous cost in aircraft, in fuel-consumed flying empty aircraft back from China, in industrial capacity dedicated to producing transport aircraft rather than bombers or fighters, and in human lives lost to the mountains and weather. The question of whether the strategic benefits justified the costs was debated during the war, and has been debated by historians since. The debate is complicated by counterfactual speculation about what would have happened if China had collapsed. Would Japan have been able to exploit Chinese resources quickly enough to significantly affect the war's outcome? Would Japanese troops freed from occupation duties in China have made decisive difference in battles elsewhere? These questions cannot be answered definitively, but informed judgment suggests that keeping China in the war was strategically valuable even at the high costs that the Hump airlift imposed. The cultural impact of the Hump experience shaped how participants thought about flying, about risk, about duty, and about what could be accomplished through determination despite terrible odds. Pilots who flew the Hump developed extraordinary skill in instrument flying, in mountain navigation, in operating aircraft at performance limits, and in making rapid life-or-death decisions under extreme stress. These skills served them well in post-war aviation careers. Many Hump veterans became airline pilots, bringing skills and judgment developed over the Himalayas to civilian operations. Others became test pilots or military aviators in subsequent conflicts. The Hump experience became a formative part of their professional identities, something they carried throughout their careers and lives. The esprit de corps among Hump veterans was strong and enduring. They had shared experiences that few others could understand. They had faced dangers together and had survived through combination of skill, determination, and luck. They maintained connections through veterans associations and reunions for decades after the war. They told stories that grew in the telling, but that captured essential truths about what it meant to fly the Hump. The stories emphasized the danger, the fear, the losses, but also the pride in accomplishing a mission that many had considered impossible. The memorial culture surrounding the Hump developed gradually as veterans aged and as historians began recognizing the operation's significance. Memorials were established in India and in China at former Hump bases. The memorials listed names of aircrew members who died flying the Hump, preserving their memory for future generations. Museums dedicated to the China-Burma-India theater collected artifacts, documents, and oral histories from Hump veterans. The artifacts included flight suits, oxygen masks, maps, photographs, and pieces of wreckage recovered from crash sites. The oral histories captured first-hand accounts of missions, of conditions, of losses, of survival. These collections preserved knowledge that would otherwise have been lost as veterans died and as the war receded into history. The technical lessons from the Hump influenced post-war aviation in multiple ways. The experience demonstrated that sustained airlift operations over hostile terrain were possible despite terrible costs, establishing precedents that would shape Cold War strategy about airlifting supplies to allies and about using air transport to project power. The Berlin airlift in 1948-1949, while conducted in very different circumstances, drew on organizational lessons and operational experience from the Hump about how to conduct sustained transport operations under difficult conditions. The Hump experience also influenced aircraft design. The problems encountered with the C-46 and other aircraft highlighted the need for more reliable engines, better pressurization, improved heating, redundant systems, and better navigation equipment. Post-war transport aircraft incorporated these improvements, creating aircraft that could conduct operations similar to the Hump with far greater safety and efficiency. The individual stories from Hump operations revealed the human dimensions that statistics cannot capture. Lieutenant William Diebold flew 198 missions over the Hump between 1943 and 1945, accumulating over 800 hours of Hump flight time, one of the highest totals achieved by any pilot. Diebold survived weather that killed dozens of other crews, mechanical problems that should have been fatal, navigation errors that put him over Japanese-held territory, and the accumulating stress of knowing that every mission could be his last. He completed his tour and returned to the United States, but the experience marked him permanently. In interviews decades later, Diebold described the Hump as the most frightening flying he experienced, despite subsequent career in military and commercial aviation that included thousands of hours of flight time. The fear came not from specific dramatic incidents, but from the relentless accumulation of danger across hundreds of missions, the knowledge that survival depended partly on skill, but largely on luck, the awareness that death was always close, despite becoming routine. Lieutenant John Smith was not so fortunate. Smith was piloting a C-46 from Chabwa to Kunming on November 12, 1944, carrying a load of aviation fuel in drums. Weather reports indicated marginal conditions over the mountains, but Smith was experienced and confident. He departed Chabwa in early morning and climbed toward the usual altitude for crossing the ridges. Radio contact was routine during the climb. Smith reported reaching 16,000 feet and entering clouds over the first ridgeline. His transmission was clear and calm, standard check-in from a pilot conducting a routine mission he had flown dozens of times before. That was the last communication received from Smith's aircraft. The C-46 never arrived at Kunming. Search aircraft flew the route looking for wreckage, but found nothing. Weather closed in over the following days, preventing additional searches. Smith and his crew of 4 were declared missing, later declared dead. What happened to them was never determined with certainty. The most likely explanation, based on weather conditions and on the pattern of other losses, was that Smith encountered severe turbulence or icing in the clouds, that his aircraft's controls became unresponsive, or that structural failure occurred, that the aircraft entered an uncontrolled descent and impacted a mountainside hidden by the clouds. The impact would have been catastrophic and instantly fatal. The wreckage would have been scattered across mountainside in terrain inaccessible to ground search. Smith's aircraft was one of approximately 35 aircraft lost during November 1944, a month when weather was particularly bad and when operational tempo was high due to demands for increased tonnage to China. The deaths barely registered in official statistics beyond updating the loss totals and removing Smith's crew from the roster of available personnel. Their families received telegrams. Their personal effects were collected and shipped home. New crews replaced them, and the missions continued. Technical Sergeant Robert Chen, a Chinese-American serving as radio operator and gunner on Hump aircraft, provided a different perspective on the operations. Chen spoke both English and Chinese fluently, and often served as interpreter during deliveries to Chinese bases. He observed the conditions under which Chinese forces operated, the desperation with which they needed supplies, the importance that each aircraft load represented to Chinese ability to continue fighting. Chen saw American aircrew complaining about the danger and difficulty of Hump operations, while Chinese soldiers were fighting with inadequate weapons and ammunition because not enough supplies could be delivered. He saw the disconnect between American concerns about safety and Chinese concerns about survival. His perspective helped American crews understand why the mission mattered despite its costs, why continuing to fly despite terrible losses was necessary, why accepting risks that seemed excessive was justified by strategic and moral necessity. Chen himself was killed in January 1945 when his aircraft crashed while attempting to land at Kunming in heavy fog. The pilot misjudged altitude during the landing approach, and the aircraft struck ground short of the runway, killing all aboard instantly. Chen's death was mourned by the crews he had flown with and by the Chinese personnel at Kunming who had known him. His funeral included both American military honors and Chinese ceremonies, reflecting his dual identity and his role bridging the cultural gap between American aircrew and Chinese forces. Lieutenant Mary Klein served as flight nurse on medical evacuation flights over the Hump, one of the few women who flew the route regularly. Klein's missions involved flying from Chinese bases to India carrying wounded American personnel, sick Chinese soldiers being evacuated for medical treatment, and occasionally civilian refugees. The medical evacuation aircraft were the same C-47s and C-46 used for cargo, hastily configured with litters for patients and with minimal medical equipment. Klein provided medical care during flights that lasted 6 to 8 hours at high altitude under conditions that would challenge medical treatment even in well-equipped hospitals. She stabilized trauma patients, managed pain, monitored vital signs, and kept critically ill patients alive long enough to reach proper medical facilities in India. The work was exhausting physically and emotionally. Klein's patients were often severely wounded or critically ill. Some died during flights despite her efforts. She worked in cold, in turbulence, while breathing oxygen, while trying to maintain sterile technique with minimal supplies in the vibrating, drafty cargo compartment of a transport aircraft. She faced the same risks as cargo crews, with the additional stress of being responsible for patients who depended on her for survival. Klein flew over 150 missions during 1944 and early 1945, evacuating hundreds of patients. She survived crashes, weather, mechanical failures, and Japanese fighters. She completed her tour and returned to the United States, where she continued nursing career, but her Hump experience remained the most intense and meaningful work of her life. In later interviews, Klein emphasized that the patients made the risks worthwhile, that knowing she was saving lives by getting wounded men to medical care justified the danger and hardship. The Japanese threat to Hump operations was real, but less significant than terrain and weather. Japanese fighters patrolled the western approaches to the Hump route, particularly over the areas where transports had to climb to cross the mountains and where they were slow and vulnerable. Japanese pilots knew the routes and knew the schedules and positioned themselves to intercept transports during predictable departure and arrival windows. The C-47s and C-46s were unarmed and had no defense beyond evasive maneuvers that were difficult for heavily loaded transports. Some aircraft were shot down by Japanese fighters, losses that were particularly bitter because they were preventable if fighters had been available to escort the transports. But escort fighters were needed elsewhere and were not available in sufficient numbers to protect every Hump flight. Pilots learned to depart at odd hours, to vary their routes when possible, to fly in clouds despite the danger because clouds protected them from visual detection by Japanese fighters. Some pilots carried personal weapons, pistols or rifles, knowing that the weapons would be useless against Japanese fighters, but feeling better for having some means of resistance. The psychological importance of feeling armed, even inadequately, was significant for crew morale despite the military insignificance of small arms against aircraft. Japanese anti-aircraft fire was similarly sporadic, but deadly when encountered. Japanese positions in Burma had anti-aircraft guns covering approaches to the mountains. Transports that flew predictable routes at predictable altitudes could find themselves under fire. The solution was to vary altitude and route, to avoid flying directly over known Japanese positions, to use terrain masking when possible. But these solutions were imperfect because the route options were limited by mountain geography, and because avoiding Japanese fire often meant accepting other risks from weather or terrain. The relationship between Hump crews and the Chinese forces they were supplying ranged from distant professionalism to close friendship depending on circumstances and personalities. Most cargo crews had minimal direct contact with Chinese forces. They landed at Chinese bases. Their cargo was unloaded by Chinese personnel. They took off and returned to India. The interactions were brief and limited by language barriers, but some crews developed relationships with Chinese personnel at bases they visited regularly, learning enough Chinese to communicate, sharing meals, exchanging gifts and letters. These relationships personalized the mission for American crews, who could see directly that their flights were keeping Chinese forces supplied and in the fight. Chinese ground personnel at forward bases often went to extraordinary lengths to help American crews who encountered problems. When aircraft made emergency landings in Chinese-held territory, Chinese forces would protect the crews from Japanese patrols, would provide food and shelter, would help repair aircraft, or would help crew members reach safe areas for evacuation. These actions were not required by formal agreements, but reflected Chinese gratitude for the supplies that American crews were delivering despite terrible losses. The mutual respect that developed between American Hump crews and Chinese forces was genuine and lasting. Veterans of both nations maintained connections after the war, corresponding across decades and visiting when possible. The end of Hump operations came in August 1945 with Japan's surrender. The last supply missions were flown in early August, after which the airlift was shut down as the strategic need disappeared. Aircraft were redeployed to other theaters or returned to the United States. Bases in India and China were closed or repurposed. Personnel were reassigned or demobilized. The logistics of shutting down the massive operation that the Hump airlift had become were complex, but within months most physical traces of the operation had been removed. The human traces would last much longer. The final statistics of Hump operations were compiled after the war. Approximately 650,000 tons of cargo had been delivered to China over the 42 months of operations. Over 2,300 aircraft had been assigned to the operation at various times. Over 600 aircraft had been lost. Over 1,500 aircrew members had died, with additional thousands injured or disabled by frostbite, oxygen deprivation, or crash injuries. The costs were staggering, but the mission had been accomplished. China had remained supplied, had remained in the war, and had tied down Japanese forces throughout the conflict. The question of whether these results justified the costs continues to be debated, but the accomplishment remains undeniable. An airlift operation that many considered impossible had been sustained for 42 months despite conditions that killed hundreds, and despite challenges that exceeded anything faced by aviators in any other theater. The memorial efforts for Hump veterans, and for those who died flying the route, expanded significantly in the decades after the war. The Hump Pilots Association was formed by veterans who wanted to preserve the operation's history and to honor those who died. The association sponsored reunions, published newsletters, collected oral histories and documents, and lobbied for memorials and recognition. Their efforts ensured that the Hump operation, which had been relatively obscure during the war, and which was overshadowed by more dramatic campaigns in Europe and the Pacific, received proper historical attention. In 1995, on the 50th anniversary of the war's end, major memorials were dedicated in India and China at former Hump bases. The ceremonies were attended by aging veterans who returned to the places where they had faced death repeatedly decades earlier. The return journeys were emotional for veterans who had survived and who remembered friends who had not. Walking onto airfields where they had last stood as young men, seeing mountains they had flown over in terror, meeting locals who remembered when the sky had been filled with American transports, all created powerful connections to past experiences and to those who had died. The memorials themselves were designed to convey both the scale of the operation and the individual human costs. Lists of names of those who died were inscribed in stone, ensuring that individual dead would be remembered rather than being reduced to statistics. Photographs and artifacts from the period were displayed, providing visual connection to the conditions and equipment. Explanatory text described the operation's strategic purpose and its costs. The educational programs about the Hump that developed in subsequent decades served multiple purposes. For aviation enthusiasts and historians, the Hump story provided insights into how sustained logistics operations were conducted under extreme conditions and what costs such operations imposed. For military professionals, the Hump story offered lessons about strategic airlift, about accepting calculated risks to achieve essential objectives, about how human factors, including crew fatigue and psychological stress, affected operations. For general audiences, the Hump story revealed an aspect of World War II that most people knew nothing about, expanding understanding beyond the familiar narratives of European combat or Pacific Island battles. The stories that Hump veterans told in their later years conveyed themes that transcended the specific historical circumstances. They talked about fear, about duty, about the bonds formed between men facing death together, about luck's role in survival, about guilt felt by survivors when friends died, about pride in accomplishing missions that seemed impossible. These themes were universal aspects of military experience across all wars and all eras, but they were manifested in the Hump's unique circumstances of flying unarmed transports over the world's highest mountains in aircraft poorly suited for the mission while carrying supplies to an ally desperate to survive. The physical traces of the Hump are gradually disappearing as decades pass. The bases in India and China were closed or converted to civilian use. Most buildings from the wartime period have been demolished or have deteriorated beyond recognition. The airfields themselves remain in many cases, now serving civilian air traffic, but the wartime infrastructure is gone. The most permanent physical traces are the wreckage sites scattered across the Himalayas where aircraft crashed and where remains lie still. Some wrecks have been discovered and investigated. Wreckage has been photographed, crash sites have been documented, remains have been recovered for identification and burial when possible. But many crash sites remain undiscovered, lying in remote valleys and on mountainsides where no one ventures. The aluminum and steel are corroding slowly. The human remains are frozen in ice or scattered by weather and animals. The artifacts that might identify specific aircraft are buried or lost. Eventually, the mountains will reclaim these sites completely, erasing even the physical evidence that aircraft flew here and died here. The documentary evidence is better preserved but scattered. Official records of Hump operations are archived in military repositories in the United States, providing detailed statistics, mission reports, personnel records, and contemporary analyses. Personal documents, including diaries, letters, and photographs, are held in various collections, some in formal archives, but many still with veterans' families. These personal documents provide texture and human detail that official records cannot capture. The oral histories collected from veterans before they died preserve first-hand accounts that might otherwise have been lost. These recordings capture voices, speech patterns, emotions, and details that written documents cannot convey. Listening to 80-year-old veterans describing missions they flew 40 or 50 years earlier, hearing their voices break when discussing friends who died, hearing them laugh about incidents that were terrifying at the time, but that became amusing in retrospect, provides connection to the past that history books cannot replicate. The challenge for historians is synthesizing these diverse sources into coherent narratives that are both accurate and engaging, that honor the veterans' experiences while placing those experiences in proper strategic and historical context. The Hump airlift stands as one of World War II's most remarkable logistics achievements and one of its most costly in proportional terms. The operation demonstrated that air supply could sustain military operations across terrain where ground supply was impossible, establishing precedents that would shape post-war military strategy, and that would influence how nations thought about projecting power. The operation also demonstrated the human costs of such operations, costs that must be weighed against strategic benefits when deciding whether to undertake missions that impose terrible sacrifices on those ordered to fly them. The pilots, crews, and support personnel who flew and maintained the Hump airlift accomplished something extraordinary. They sustained an air supply operation under conditions that would be considered unacceptably dangerous, even by wartime standards, accepting losses that would shut down any comparable modern operation, delivering supplies that kept China in the war and that contributed to Japan's eventual defeat. They did this not because they were seeking glory or because they believed their mission would make them famous. They did it because they were ordered to do it, because their nation and their allies needed it done, because the strategic situation demanded it despite the costs. Most of them survived, completed their tours, returned home, and resumed civilian lives, where their wartime service became memories they shared primarily with other veterans who understood. Some did not survive, disappearing into the mountains where they remain still, their final moments unknown, their sacrifices remembered primarily by those who flew with them and by historians who preserved their stories. The Hump operation in total represents what can be accomplished when people are willing to accept terrible risks for essential purposes. When ordinary people are asked to do extraordinary things and somehow find within themselves the courage and skill to do them. When nations commit to missions despite knowing that the costs will be high and that many will die, but calculating that the alternative of not acting would be even worse. These calculations are never made lightly and are never comfortable because they involve measuring human lives against strategic objectives, a moral calculus that has no perfect answers. But the calculations must sometimes be made, and the missions must sometimes be flown, because the alternative is accepting defeat or allowing allies to fall. The men and women who flew the Hump understood this, even if they could not have articulated it in strategic terms. They knew their missions mattered. They knew China needed the supplies they carried. They knew that refusing to fly was not an option. So they flew, day after day, month after month, accepting the risks and the losses, because that was what duty required, and what the mission demanded. The legacy of the Hump extends beyond World War II history into broader questions about aviation, about logistics, about strategy, and about the human capacity to persist through danger and hardship toward essential goals. Every modern military airlift operation owes something to the Hump, to the lessons learned about what works and what fails when trying to supply forces by air across difficult terrain. Every transport pilot who flies into war zones or disaster areas is following paths pioneered by Hump crews who proved that determined aviators in adequate aircraft could deliver cargo despite weather, terrain, and enemy action that made such operations appear impossible. The Hump veterans would likely be uncomfortable with such grandiose claims about their legacy. Most veterans describe themselves simply as people who did their jobs, who flew their missions, who tried to survive and to help their friends survive. The heroism they demonstrated, if they acknowledged it at all, was the quiet heroism of showing up day after day to face dangers that could easily kill them, the courage to climb into cockpits and fly into mountains and weather that had killed their friends, the determination to complete missions despite knowing the statistics and despite watching loss totals climb. This is a different kind of heroism than the dramatic individual acts celebrated in movies and popular histories. It is the heroism of sustained courage over time, of accepting danger as routine, of continuing when fear would counsel stopping, of doing duty when every instinct argues for self-preservation. This is the heroism that sustains military operations over months and years, the kind that wins wars not through dramatic victories, but through refusal to quit, even when the costs are terrible and when individual survival seems unlikely. The Hump airlift cost over 1,500 American lives, destroyed over 600 aircraft, consumed immense resources, and delivered tonnage that was barely adequate to keep China supplied at minimal levels. It was expensive, inefficient, and brutal. It was also essential, successful, and represents one of the most impressive logistics achievements of the entire war. These seemingly contradictory assessments are both true because the Hump was complicated in ways that simple judgments cannot capture. It was a magnificent accomplishment that should not have been necessary and that should have been conducted differently if better options had existed. It was a strategic success purchased at tactical costs that would have been unacceptable in most circumstances. It was proof of what determination and courage could achieve, and simultaneously was demonstration of how terrible the costs could be when terrain, weather, and inadequate equipment combined to kill people who were doing their best in impossible circumstances. The mountains where Hump crews died remain largely unchanged. The peaks that killed so many still stand, indifferent to human efforts and human losses. The valleys where aircraft disappeared still hold their secrets. The weather that tore aircraft apart still builds and dissipates according to patterns that have existed for millions of years. The Himalayas do not remember or honor the humans who challenged them during those 42 months from 1942 to 1945. But humans remember. Veterans remember. Historians remember. And through that remembering, the sacrifices and accomplishments of those who flew the Hump are preserved against the forgetting that time would otherwise impose.